we are excited to be here with KaiserBauch.
No, KaiserBauch.
Okay, so if you guys haven't seen his channel, it is a fantastic channel if you're interested. If you guys ever watch our channel and your response is, I hate how political they've gotten. I wish they just focused on fertility rates
and the data
and did really deep dive on individual countries, looking at the entire history of their fertility rate. His is the channel to go to. That is the channel that you are thinking of that ours is not, because I don't have the time to do that research and someone else is already doing it. So what I wanted to focus on with this episode is, having done all of these incredible deep dives on geographies around the world and the fertility rates that they're seeing, both the rises and drops over time, I want to get a synthesis of your ideas or patterns you've recognized that could be useful to either resolving this issue, predicting when it's going to happen, etc. So go ahead, get us started here.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for having me. And I mean, this is kind of a complicated question, to be honest, because one of the things that I really try to focus on in my videos is the differences between different countries, or let's say civilizations or regions, and trying to figure out why two different countries in modern period have like vastly different level of fertility rates. Because people often talk about low fertility rates as if they were like a singular phenomenon, but there is a very wide range of low fertility rates. Like completely, one thing is like South Korea or East Asia, where you have really like fertility rates under one child per woman. And completely other thing is like the Anglosphere, where even though the fertility rates are below replacement, they generally tend to be more close to like 2 children per woman, or at least in the 1.5 to 2 children per woman range. And this makes the situation, let's say, much more stable and easily handleable in the long run. So what really interests me is to like dig deep and try to find out why are there these differences. Because it seems to me there are these like big, broad macro factors that influence basically the whole world and that depress the fertility rates everywhere, which is like all the well-known stuff, like the decrease in infant mortality rates, then urbanization, female education, lack of religiosity, urbanization, all of this. But then there are these like very country or let's say region specific details which make, for example, South Korea have fertility rates that is almost one child lower than that, for example, in the United States. So it's very hard to find some like unifying traits that would be applicable to all of the countries.
Well, I think a good place to start in is unifying traits that people don't think about. So here's an example. Why is Latin America's fertility rate, in your estimation, crashing so quickly?
Well, I mean, what is happening in Latin America, but what is happening more broadly all over the world in these past, like, let's say 5 or 6 years, or maybe since the COVID pandemic, really, I would say, is that like we are now seeing fertility rates really crash to very low levels in many countries all over the world. A lot of them are in South America, like Chile, for example. It is possible that Chile will have a fertility rate lower than one child per woman this year, maybe, or this year, 2024, so last year actually. But there are also other countries around the globe that are seeing this like massive fertility crash that is very fast. It is happening in remarkably short period of time.
Like what other countries?
Well, I think Thailand is now having very low fertility rate, and but also there we can observe that a lot of the countries I previously talked about, for example, like UK or Canada or even the United States, that had like fertility rates that were decent, that were relatively close to two children per woman, are now going even deeper. Also, a lot of countries in Eastern Europe are seeing their fertility rates crash very close to like one child per woman. For example, countries in the Baltic, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they had fertility rates that were relatively reasonable 5 or 6, 7 years ago, and now they all crashed down close to one child per woman. And I think that probably the most logical explanation to me is that new generation of young people is growing up, and they are comprising a larger and larger proportion of childbearing cohorts in these countries. And I think these younger generations are like really negatively influenced by the digitalization of their lives.
I was going to say, I think one thing that people are underestimating, especially for this post-COVID generation, when they're like, how is this happening all over the world at once, is how unified the culture that the internet generation consumes is. While there might be regional colors, the movies that a young person in Estonia is watching these days is going to be the same movies that a young person in the US is watching, was maybe a 20% difference. Same with rural Guatemala, same with pretty much anywhere in the world. And I think that we have overestimated how much cultural uniqueness there still is in the world.
I completely agree with you on this, and
So
I would
tell me
say
more.
maybe more so than the movies. Even it's things like Tinder, or like the way young people are now getting or not getting into relationships, to be more precise.
Yeah.
It's really spread all over the world, and I think like just the general lack of social relations, or the digitalization of social relations, is, in my opinion, probably the most influential part of the equation when we are talking about this specific period of the last, like, maybe decade or 5, 6, 7 years, in which we've seen these really like big fertility declines. I would say is probably the biggest part of this. Yeah,
What
yeah,
do
yeah.
you think about this theory around cell phones? We covered it recently. I was really surprised. It sort of came out of nowhere for me. And the theory goes like this, that cell phones are basically everywhere now, and cell phones are more fun than having sex or kids or socializing with people. And the way the theory was presented that I heard it is, when I was a kid, you had like Snake on your cell phone, like very simple
Oh
games.
yeah, yeah.
And so, like, if a friend says, like, come over to my place, there was nothing better to do, really. You could watch what was on TV, like pre-scheduled programming, or play Snake on your cell phone, right? But now you can watch and engage in literally any environment or game you want to, or any sort of social interaction you want to. So why have in-person interactions anymore? Do you buy into this theory?
Oh well, of course. This is just overstimulation, I would say. It is like, I mean, a young guy growing up today, the amount of content or the amount of fun or the amount of games or pornography, whatever, is so vast. It's basically never ending. It's infinite. So you can basically spend your whole like couple of years growing up in your room, and you are able to like experience things that would be unthinkable like 2 decades ago. It's true. On the other hand, I don't know if I could say it's more fun. It probably is in some like superficial manner, but it's not fulfilling. Like, people are not
Yeah.
happy with this reality. They are not. So I would say, yeah, this is like basically some form, maybe like a dopamine addiction or overstimulation. But I don't think it is like leading to people
So
having
you don't
fulfilled
think it's a
lives.
marketplace issue. You think it's an oversaturation issue.
Well, yeah,
So
that would be
I'll
probably my
describe
guess.
the different scenarios, because I actually think it's a marketplace issue more than an oversaturation issue. The marketplace issue is saying, if I am deciding between two activities, there's this whole new category of activities I might choose over wanting to be a parent or going on a date or having sex. And the thing that really gets me about this theory, and I think that you highlighted this for me when you were just talking, is that people have been like, oh, people aren't having kids because of like porn. But it's like, I know more guys who turn down sex or a date because of a good video game than because of porn.
Well, yeah, yeah, that might be the case. Sure. I mean, I would say the analogy I was thinking about in this regard some times ago was that, the digital technology, internet, all of its smartphones, it's all
Mhm.
connected, and it was sort of like it was just the younger generation was thrown into it without any sort of, like, form of meaningful supervision, because basically when I was growing up, my parents were not really able to control what I do online because they just didn't have the skill. Like, my father was really lucky when he was able to put an attachment to an email, so he wasn't like able to control what I'm doing online. And I think this is maybe similar to like when there was an industrial revolution, And like one generation of kids was just getting a really bad like health impacts from all the chimneys and all the factories. And then people said like, okay, this is not really good. We have to somehow make this work differently so the negative impacts are not so big. And then it was sort of regulated. And I think we might be in the process where the younger generation was sort of thrown into this, and it just needs to somehow, figure out how to live in this completely changed technological environment. And I mean, in this regard, I'm pretty much on board with stuff that like maybe Jonathan Haidt said about this, if you are familiar with him, that like I really think the approach towards kids and their like approach to technologies should be somehow regulated. I don't know if you agree, but like I would say it shouldn't be like completely unregulated how it is now.
I think it's very hard to do.
Yeah,
I think anything. I mean, the problem with kids is they're better with technology than we are.
Yeah.
And one of the jokes in the U.S. is I don't know if you know this, but Simone, I didn't know this until recently. About 50% of the states in the U.S. like effectively have a porn ban.
Really?
Yeah, like requiring like an ID if you're accessing Pornhub and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, like
really,
that's.
But as people point out, it's really only a ban for people too old to know how to use a VPN.
Sure.
And that's the thing about any sort of technology ban is it is inversely effective against the population that needs it the most.
Oh, I completely agree. And when I talk about regulation, I do not necessarily mean like administrative or legal regulation. I mean mostly like within families, I would say. Like, so maybe I didn't like say it right. I think like parents really need to try to somehow regulate what their kids are doing out there, even if it's not easy. But I would actually say that the difference between the approach to technology of different generations is now a bit smaller. So I use the example with my father. So I'm basically in my late 20s, and when I was growing up, like maybe in 2005, 2007, 2010, like the gap between my digital skills and my, let's say, parents' digital skills was really, really big. I would say now I'm also a parent now. I have a kid. Unless there is some like really, which is possible, really, really new, massive like jump in the technological innovation, I would say that the gap will be smaller for the parents today with their kids.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to ask you about some specific countries here. What are your thoughts on the North Korean dropping fertility rate? You think that's just due to like scarcity of food or something else?
Oh, to be completely honest, do we even know the data is like correct? Because I'm gonna be honest with you, I haven't really looked deep into North Korea, because my approach was like, I don't really know what is going on in that country in great detail. I do not have the information. I'm not really sure, because do you know?
Okay.
Maybe you have.
What are your thoughts on Israel then? Total opposite.
Israel is my favorite. Like Israel, I'm gonna get some heat for this comment, but like for a person that is demographic buff, like Israel is incredibly interesting, because they are able to walk the fine line between like group cohesion, enough to have like big families and strong cultural norms, and enough individualism to have like modern, prosperous, innovative economy. And I would say that with Israel, it is like all about the common purpose of the people. They just know why they should have kids. They do not need to be persuaded. You need to have kids because it's good. It's it gives you stability. It is what gives life its meaning. People are like, okay, that is all sort of like individual, these values. But I would say in Israel, they have really strong feeling of like, okay, we have our country. We have fought to have it really hard. We are still fighting to have it, and we do not want to lose it. And we cannot afford to start to massively aging and dying out, because we are actually standing against like this huge numerical mass around us that is demographically much stronger than we are. So I would say that in Israel, it is really about this like common sense of purpose, of national purpose.
So the last time we spoke, when we accidentally forgot to record our conversation, you had just finished making your Kazakhstan video and it hadn't gone live yet. And it's really interesting for a couple of reasons, because they are like this I mean, okay, their fertility is not amazing, but they're doing pretty well. And especially the number of people in Kazakhstan who are having a lot of kids,
Yes.
like 4+ kids, is notable. I mean, it's a much bigger proportion of the population than in other areas. And you pointed out that there's more of a cultural norm around having a lot of kids. And there's also more of a cultural norm of still living with your parents and having kids and being married while in your 20s and while going to university. So here's an example of a place where people are having kids while also getting higher levels of educational attainment, while experiencing an increase in national wealth, while also not being incredibly like religiously conservative, similar to Israel, right? Like Israel has a lot of religion, but it's not crazy about it. Like it's not, and Arya Babu wrote a great Substack piece drawing a correlation between countries that were sort of overall very religiously conservative and those which weren't, but had very religiously conservative pockets, and found that basically if you lived in a country that was uniformly very religiously conservative, birth rates on average were lower, perhaps because there's this feeling like it's imposed on you, or like you don't have a choice, or like the standards are so high, how could you possibly keep up with it? Whereas maybe when there isn't this sort of oppressive religious overtone in a country, there's more enthusiasm about having kids. I don't know, like we haven't gotten to the bottom of that, but it seemed to be something that showed up also in Kazakhstan, where yes, 10% of the population would support the idea of Sharia law, but that's quite low compared to countries where Sharia law is actually imposed.
Sure.
So I think that's a really interesting example, and I'm much more interested in what do we take away, or like
creating it there.
Sorry, once again, please.
What's creating the high fertility rate or the resistance to fertility collapse was in Kazakhstan?
Well, so the Kazakhstan case is pretty interesting because usually when I do these deep dives and I'm trying to find out why some country has like notably lower or notably higher fertility than others, I usually manage to like figure out this like one specific thing that I then think is the reason. But with, as for example, with Israel, as we were talking about before, but with Kazakhstan, to be honest, I haven't really found like some magical ingredients that would explain it. My takeaway was that it just works there. I'm not sure what specifically is behind it, but as Simone said, the country is religious, but it is not overtly religious. It is a Muslim country predominantly, but there is also ethnically Russian minority, which is Orthodox, and there are no big like problems there. Relatively few people support things like Sharia law. The population is very much educated, so there is, for example, very low proportion of women that would be illiterate, basically close to zero. That is maybe like an inheritance from the Soviet times, because like the Soviet system, however bad it was pretty keen on education. So the country is also have relatively high urbanization rate, not too much, but relatively high. The GDP per capita, it's not like Israel, it's poorer country, but it is not like impoverished in any way. There are richer countries that have much lower fertility. So it just works. I was talking to some people from Kazakhstan, and one of them told me that due to the sort of like tragic history of Kazakhstan in the 20th century, there was a big famine in the 1930s where a lot of Kazakh people died, and the population of Kazakhs actually decreased quite a bit. And he told me that there is a bit of like pro-natalist sentiment connected to this, that they want to like replenish the population, which came close to being like drastically reduced.
That's interesting.
That is in some ways similar to Israel. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and similar to other studies that have shown that like on the same island that has been hit by a tsunami, small subregions that had more casualties actually had higher fertilities after that than those that had lower casualties. Like there's a reaction to tragedy.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what this is, Simone. This is a totally different.
Well, but what I think, well, like, I don't know, listening again to that YouTube video, which is just so good. And again, everyone's got to check out the YouTube channel. There's such good deep dives on the full history, the cultural, the economic, the political incentives and disincentives toward fertility. Was just that, like, it's kind of a societal default that's societally supported on all ends. And that specifically the way that families form and function provides a default path in life where, of course, you're going to have kids at that stage. Like, of course, in your 20s, while you're living with your parents and going through university, Like it makes sense to start your family. And that's what makes the biggest difference. I think that the big driver behind these sudden drops in fertility is fewer mistake babies had by teens, which is good. Like we don't want a lot of unprepared people who don't want children to be having children. So like I'm not necessarily against those drops. What we're seeing on the flip side with these declines is people delaying having kids because they
But
believe,
this is
and
a
also
totally different phenomenon, Simone. So you're connecting now a totally new phenomenon, a third unrelated. So the phenomenon you're talking about is different from the phenomenon of tragedy leading to increased fertility rate, like we likely saw.
I'm
with
talking
World
about
War
a separate
II.
one. I'm talking. This
Okay.
is independent of the tragedy thing.
And then there's the separate phenomenon, which is at place within Kazakhstan and Israel, which is a cultural identity of anxiety around disappearing or being erased by enemy factions, which does seem to be able to persistently increase fertility within a region, and is something I would actually encourage most families to adopt. This idea that your family is different or your small cultural group is different.
Which I think, by the way, is also improved by diversity. So if you combine, there's like a bunch of tiny factors here that I think come together.
I agree with
if you
this.
combine the fact that there was tragedy in the past, also that there's more diversity, relatively speaking, in
Explain what you mean
Kazakhstan.
by diversity is like if you're a Kazakhstani, you go out and you see the Russian immigrants that were brought to replace you every day.
Yeah.
And their fertility rates are super low. Anyway, we'll let Kaiser talk.
Oh, yeah, well, so I agree that the high fertility in Kazakhstan is specific for the ethnic Kazakhs. There are also other groups like Tajiks and other like local Central Asian groups. Their fertility is also high, but the fertility of ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan is relatively low, even though it is higher than in Russia, which is just like a trivia, but it's still sub-replacement firmly. But yeah, but then again, it is always a bit of alchemy, because you can definitely find groups around the globe that underwent genocide or like these comparable events, and their fertility is not boosted by it. So
Like-
I mean, you can maybe like you can argue maybe, for example, Native Americans
True.
could be
Terrible
seen.
fertility rates.
Yeah. So it's always like, and now at this point I'm not really able to come up with some other group like that, but I'm sure there are groups that underwent like big genocide like
I'd be
events.
very interested. Do you know the difference between the Native American fertility rates within Latin American populations, like the Mesoamerican people?
Well, do you mean between different countries?
No.
Latin
I
America?
mean, like, so in the United States, you've
Yes.
got Native American populations, but they're generally pretty small. In Latin America, there's some really big Native American
Sure,
populations,
sure.
like the descendants of like the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Inca and stuff like that. I am like in my head, I'm wondering, did they have a differentiated fertility rate from the settler population of like
Oh, yes.
Spanish types?
Okay, so I was not looking specifically into this phenomenon. However, I would be willing to bet that a lot of these communities will have higher fertility than like the settler populations. But then again, it is a question. I would say a lot of it would be probably explained by like socioeconomic factors. I would guess that these Native Americans in Latin America will be much more rural, will have much less income, or will be like on a lower scale of the socioeconomic development in comparison with the settler populations, which will be probably more urban and, let's say, in the higher stratas of the socioeconomic ladder. So I would say here the differences would be probably explainable by just socioeconomic factors.
Well, I mean, but in the United States, Native Americans are more rural and more poor, and they have a worse fertility rate than the white population.
Well, yeah, that is true. That is true. I mean, I guess you always have to approach any group like on an individual basis. I would say personally in North America, there among I'm no expert on Native Americans, but I always get the sense that they really like lost their world, and they are sort of like surviving in a world that is not really theirs. I don't know if it is, but there is like, it always seemed to me that way. While in Latin America, it seems to me that it just all merged into this new entity, which is like equally native and European, and a bit of like African slavery ancestry in there. But it like I was doing a video on Brazil, and Brazil is really like what makes Brazil, for example, very different from like North America is that the population just mixed from the very beginning. And it like most Brazilians are just like this sort of like brownish population that is just that have parts of ancestry from all the main free ancestry groups, which is like native populations to Latin America, European, mostly Portuguese settlers, and then slaves brought from Africa. So it's like it was just a very different story demographically from the North America, where the groups didn't really intermingle
What's
demographically speaking.
Brazil's fertility rate like when contrasted with other countries?
Once again, sorry.
How is Brazil's fertility rate doing?
Oh, bad. It's not good. Brazil is one of the countries that I could mention when you were asking in the beginning, which underwent pretty massive fertility decline in the past, like half a decade to decade. Yeah.
So I want to get your thoughts on my religion theory that I've had for this.
Okay.
Because you'd likely be able to like get a feel of this. So I sort of have this theory that there is an overlay. Obviously, there's all the main things that affect fertility, like urbanization, wealth, etc. But then when you take all of those into account, my argument is that various religious overlays seem to have an additional effect of fertility, either up or down, with the most negative ones being East Asian religious systems, specifically, you know, like Shinto, Buddhism, Taoism, all of that category of stuff. But the ones that are more surprising to people is where the Judeo-Christian ones fall. The ones that are the most protective of fertility rates is Judaism at the very top. Then under Judaism, Protestant Christianity. Then under Protestant Christianity, which often I think surprises people, are the Muslim groups. Then under the Muslim groups are Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, which seem to have like unusually low fertility rates.
Yeah. So, well, what I find very interesting about comparisons of different religions is basically that, broadly speaking, Abrahamic religions, all of them, like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, there exists within these religions, there exists a correlation between religiosity and fertility. So highly religious people in Abrahamic religions do have more children, do have larger families. In comparison to that, for example, people from Buddhist countries or Hinduist countries, so like India, this correlation is non-existent there. It isn't there. So being a highly devoted Buddhist or highly devoted Hindu is not connected to having larger family, which is really interesting. And when you think about, like, I'm not like expert on Hinduism or Buddhism, but when I was researching it, it seems like the idea of sort of escaping the suffering of life, to escaping the never-ending cycle of like reincarnations and all the stuff connected to it, is like the highest goal of these religions.
Yeah, it's like, inherently antinatalist. It's about species-wide destruction.
Sort of. There is an element that is like inherently antinatalist in these religions. I agree. So this is what I find very interesting. And like, if we would compare like different Abrahamic religions, that I mostly would agree with, or like that is probably supported by data, what you stated about the different religious group. And I would say why Catholicism is like lower than Protestantism. My take would probably be that Catholicism is like really universal, while the Protestantism is really good at like maintaining this like smaller, more narrow, like sect-based attitude, where you have like a lot of
makes a lot of sense.
Which have this like very
I know, I love this. I hadn't thought about this before. I'm going to reframe this a little bit. Most in the same way that Jews are like, we are Jews, we are different, and we are better. A lot of Protestant groups feel that way about themselves, whereas a lot of Catholic groups intrinsically are like, and we're going to convert you because there's no difference between us and you, and you'll be Catholics one day eventually.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree with this. But then again, Islam is also very universalist. It is similar maybe to Catholicism in this way, and there seems to be higher fertility. On the other hand, a lot of the Muslim world is relatively socio-economically backward. I don't want to offend anyone, but broadly speaking,
check out our video, Why Are Muslims So Poor?
Yeah, I will.
we have a video on this.
Yeah,
but continue.
But broadly speaking, it is true that Muslim world is less wealthy, and this obviously interplays with fertility. And when you look at some countries that managed to reach some level of wealth, level of development, level of urbanization, level of education, all these like classic points. For example, Turkey, Iran, some other countries, the fertility is sub-replacement. So I do not think Islam will be like inherently able to resist this. It was just later to arrive into like modernity defined by some of these traits like, urbanization, education, economic prosperity, and so on.
That makes sense.
Okay, what I'm really curious is, I mean, now that you've just done so many deep dives on different regions and cultures, if you could design, like, let's say someone said, here's a bunch of territory, you can turn this into a city state. You can choose who is allowed to emigrate to your zone, and your job is to create a thriving, but also like high fertility country. Like we need this to be at least like the one bastion of humanity that grows in the future. Yeah, other than Israel. How would you design this city-state? What kind of culture would you try to perpetuate? What economic policies would you implement? Are there even like industries that you would promote or try to keep out of your city-state? What would you do?
Okay, well, that is a really interesting question. I have to admit I haven't talked about this from this sort of like playing the God perspective. How would I do it? But I would say what would be really important is to let people have autonomy in their family lives, in their community lives, because I would say what connects a lot of these high fertility groups is that they have like a very considerable amount of autonomy within the societies they function in. And I think this is like really important. So basically, if you have groups that are intrinsically programmed or like culturally predisposed to have high fertility, just let them do their thing and do not mingle with their cultural beliefs. And then, like, I mean, what specific sorts of people I would like invite to these hypothetical state? I mean, there are that would just be a matter of maybe my cultural preference, so like probably my cultural preference would be closer to like some Christian groups, maybe some Protestant Christian groups, than to, for example, Haredi Jews or some highly religious Muslims. But I don't think that is a matter of like what is better for fertility. That would be just a matter of maybe my cultural preference, which is like defined by my where I'm from and stuff. Yeah.
And you can always cheese the numbers just by, like inviting Jews. So I do like the idea of like, okay, you're starting from scratch here. Very interesting. How would you go for like a millet system? This is what I've promoted before. But do you know what I mean when I talk about a millet system?
Oh, I'm not sure now. Please.
Okay, so a millet system was used in the Ottoman Empire, and they basically had a different court system and
I know.
laws for every sub-religious community, and the tax base was collected by the individual religious communities and then distributed through them.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm like, I think this is a very like complex issue, and the millet system, as far as I know, had like it definitely, the Ottoman Empire is well known for the different like ethnic and religious groups within it having quite a lot of autonomy and like a certain degree of self rule.
Yeah.
But then again, I mean, it came to like it was not like able to stand up in the competition against other big states or empires that were like more centralized and have like more more unified bureaucracy, and they were then more efficient and stuff. But we are comparing like different time periods, and what was maybe functioning then in some regards would not be functioning now, and vice versa. So like I don't know, to be honest. I don't know.
Well, this is I think an interesting thing that we civilizationally don't talk about right now. But the country that's really bucking the trends here, and the countries that we see bucking the trends, if you look at like Kazakhstan or you look at Israel, are countries where you have a native population or a population that sees themselves as native, like the Kazakhstan or Israel, and a bit of an ethno state, but an ethno state that allows for a large degree of diversity. So in Israel, for example, there is an understanding that this is the Jewish state for the Jewish people, but we have a huge chunk of the population that's Muslim and Christian and everything like that. And I wonder if this system for running things could be the most effective.
Well, it might. I mean, it's definitely true, and there is also research to support this from Paul Morland, demographer, that says
Mhm.
that basically like ethnic competition between ethnic groups can definitely lead to higher fertility. It was the case in Israel, and like in the between Israelis and Palestinian Arabs, there was this like sense of ethnic competition. They were trying to outbreed each other, and there was a time, I think this was in the 1980s and maybe 1990s, where like women in the Gaza Strip were having like 8 or 9 children per woman, which was, even back then, it was like out of sync with the standards in the Muslim world on the same level of
Mhm.
socioeconomic development back then. And the research proved that it was like very much maintained also by the sense of ethnic rivalry between the groups. Another example of this was Northern Ireland, where basically the Catholics in Northern Ireland, they were a minority, and they are now basically, it's 50-50, and they probably have like a majority among the younger generations. And
Well,
it now stopped because the conflict, fortunately, is like it's not really like going on anymore. But back then, in like the 1970s, 80s, when there was really like a pretty big ethnic conflict in Northern Ireland, and all the bomb attacks and everything, and IRA, there was also a sense of like higher fertility among Catholics in Northern Ireland, and their mission was to like outbreed the Protestants. So there are cases where this happens. Also, another case was from Sri Lanka, where I don't remember exactly the
I'm
name
not
of the
familiar
group.
with this one.
Yeah. There was also a bit of like ethnic competition going on in Sri Lanka between the two groups. One was Tamils, and I don't remember the other, unfortunately. Sorry, but yeah. So this is documented that like ethnic conflict or like sense of ethnic danger can definitely lead to higher fertility. But then again, there are other cases where it just doesn't happen. So it's always a bit of alchemy. Like it is one of the ingredients, but there is always something you like. It's
Yeah.
not universally applicable.
We need a race war, is what you're saying.
No.
A,
Helter
a
Skelter.
race war. I'll put on the South Park scene here. So, okay. So I was going to ask you, what are your thoughts on because one of the statistics that always shocked me was that like 50% of European countries going into, I think it was World War One, were
Mhm.
below repopulation rate. What are your thoughts on that previous sort of European fertility collapse before the
Yeah.
baby boom?
Okay, so I don't think it was World War One. I think this is World War Two, I would say.
World War
And
Two. Okay, yeah.
yeah. And this was basically between the wars, and I think a lot of it was connected to the great crisis, the great economic crisis of the 1930s. So the fertility rate went under 2 children per woman in the times of the Great Depression. Yeah, that was the word I was looking for. Great Depression. And then after World War, it went up again. I mean, I would say a lot of the countries in Western Europe, like countries that were really like the most developed countries in the world back then, Germany, UK, France, I would say they were more or less culturally ready for low fertility back then. And in the environment between the wars, which was kind of like, how to say, like, there was the Great Depression, which was big economic crisis. There was sort of this sense of like, Weimar Germany. It was sort of like decadent. All values were questioned. A lot of like, a lot of free thinking people. But I would say it was not. Also a lot of like, I don't know. Sorry, I got sort of tangled up in this now. But yeah, it is true, a lot of people do not notice that there was a period of relatively low fertility, under 2 children per woman, even back then, when a lot of people suppose it was just like high fertility all the way up, 1990s or 1980s. And then it went up again after the World War II, in what is known as the baby boom, where the generation of baby boomers were born. But yeah, I would say a lot of it could be explained by the Great Depression, probably.
Mm.
Or do you have some alternative explanation for that?
No, my explanation is it was just a continued trend, and that it had been going down for a really long time, and that the illusion of the baby boom would mostly came from better fertility technology, and that fertility has mostly just been a line going downwards in Europe since the 1800s.
Okay, so, and what do you mean by the better fertility technologies of the baby boom?
The number of babies that died early decreased dramatically, and that explains almost all of the rise in births.
Well, but okay, now I don't hear you. Okay, yeah. Oh, now I hear you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I cut out there. Yeah,
Yeah, but
basically, what we argue is there wasn't a rise in births; there was a rise in surviving babies.
Okay, okay. Well, I mean, I would have to look at the data more thoroughly in regards to this, but I would say that like the fertility rate data would be probably like cleared of this phenomenon. No, I don't know if I'm mistaken, but I would say like the fertility rate is sort of like, I think this would be taken into account, right? Like if they are measuring the children per woman.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I think there was a genuine spike in fertility rates after World War II, but it was just, it was clearly limited in time. It just ended at some point and it never came back.
Well, I think one thing about the end of World War II that people forget, if we're looking at like why is Israel's fertility rate high, and you have this like I'm proud to be a Jew, like this level of jingoism, everything like that, and you look at the types of media, whether it was cartoons or movies or media being produced, comic books being produced in the U.S. at the end of World War II, you had a really high degree of jingoism that made you proud to want more Americans. That was probably a big part of it as well.
Oh, well, sure, I agree with that. There was just this sort of like cultural upswing, and it happened not only in the United States. It was the baby boom was like strongest in the United States. I think in the United States there were a couple of years where the fertility rate was over 3 children per woman in the 1950s and maybe 1960s. But it happened also in European countries. You had baby boom was in, I think, in like France, in UK, in Germany. In Germany it was weaker, but
I remember it didn't happen in the countries that didn't participate in the war. Like Ireland didn't get one, if I remember.
Yeah. I mean, sure. I would say that there was probably sense of like relief and sense of like now we can go back to like normal life. So like we are enjoying the ability to live normal life and to have families because we've been through this like traumatic experience, and maybe even a sense, maybe like in Germany, one would say there might be even a sense of like, okay, let's not think about what happened and let's just, let's have family, let's go to work, let's just live normal life. But then like it all ended like in what is also just, sorry, give me a minute, I need to put my phone into charger. I just need to put out my charger from just give me 10 seconds.
And Malcolm, I think your mic came unplugged. I think it's just your laptop's mic picking up your audio now. So just make sure it's
for touching that.
The sooner we identify, the better.
Okay, yeah, all set now. And there's also this really interesting statistic about like how in most countries the precise year in which the fertility rate went under 2 and basically never recovered was 1973, which was the year of like the global oil shock crisis and when like this stagflation period of the 1970s started, which also shows that like while, I mean, one of the big questions that people often ask is it is culture or it's economy. And more I think about this, I kind of came to a conclusion that this line is sort of artificial because like those things are so interconnected. Like economy influences culture and culture influences economics, and it's basically like this big bundle of like human behavior which is mutually influencing each other. So I don't know if like one can really separate it completely. But without a doubt, as with the example of the Great Depression of the 1930s, and with this example of like this fertility drop in the 1973, economic factors indubitably play a big role. Like they influence things. They usually lead to like spikes and or increases that could be temporary, but the thing about the 1973 decrease was that it became like permanent. It never went up again, like for example after the World War II.
I also, though, I feel like there's this turning point that's not discussed a whole lot because it's really difficult to track, that took place starting around the 1960s, where media became more globally homogenous and more broadly consumed. And also where media set very different standards in terms of aspirations in life that were more oriented around youth, like sort of aspirations that people would want as teenagers, like travel, glamour, wealth, career, instead of family life. And I don't know, like at that same time, I also see this beginning of a tipping point, which just gets logarithmically worse over time. that just orients people away from immediately wanting to start a family, and instead thinking a family is something that you start once you achieve all these other factors. It's like established career, wealth, own a home, all these things, which now, I mean, also, yes, economics plays a big role, is becoming increasingly difficult for people to achieve. But still, I like culture, and what is marked as your default path in life plus is desirable has really, I think, played a huge role. That you still cover in your content too. I just want to emphasize it.
Oh, undeniably, without any doubt, like the aspirations of people in life, and like what people perceive as an ideal life changed incredibly, and it makes a huge difference. I completely agree with that, and probably more so with women than with men. I would say that like the change in how women perceive their lives and how women like see their ideal path in life is probably more important here, because in the end, like, women are the ones who have the biggest word and biggest role to play in childbearing. So they're like
and when women had the most violent shift in life aspirations, because
definitely
men already like wanted to establish their careers and build wealth and stuff. And sorry, that didn't mean necessarily that they were going to sorry, she's grabbing all the things, like forego family. Whereas for women, there are trade-offs, and it does become exceedingly difficult without copious governmental or societal or family support to make those things happen at the same time. So I mean, I agree with you. Like, I'm not normally the person that says that feminism plays a role, but certainly like this expectation that women should put their careers and wealth building first before starting a family plays a huge role in the downfall of any nation.
Oh, most definitely. But then again, I don't know if this is true, but it is sort of interesting hypothesis I read somewhere, that basically this whole like feminist movement, or this whole notion that women should like work, should build careers, should be very successful, should basically to a certain degree emulate men in their like goals and standards, is basically a form of cope with the fact that men today is not able to provide for the whole family with one salary. So basically it was like, okay, we can't have the sort of life we used to have, so we just gonna rationalize why what we have now is better, if you understand what I mean. So I don't know if that's
very interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. I'm not sure where I heard this, but it got my attention.
My question is, how do we force women to be obedient?
Yeah.
Okay. This is that we have so many articles about us that are so angry because they're all based on like our title cards and they don't watch the episodes.
Yeah.
And it's stuff like that. It's like there was a big article on us in Salon today that's like that's screeching. Anyway, it was great to have you on. Any final thoughts?
I mean, as your question went, how do we make women more obedient? I would say the answer to this is, well, first of all, I don't really know, but I would say they need to want to be obedient. Like you can very often find people, most usually like young guys, that are sort of frustrated and disaffection with their situation, that really wants to go for some sort of like forced and brutal and like top-down approach. We should like we just should, like put
A
into
stick is their answer.
Yeah, let's put into constitution that women need to like get married, but it won't work. Like, it won't work. You don't want to force people to have families, because that will be just hell for everyone involved and for the children first and foremost. So we need to come up with cultural norms that would incentivize people to, and women to, like, want to function in this sort of environment.
Yeah. You know,
Totally agreed.
A really good one that we used to have was this thing called marriage.
Yeah, well,
but we kind of broke that.
it is true. Yeah. But then again, it's question once again, if what is more important here, if it is the cultural aspect or the economic aspect. Well, since women massively enter the workforce and start earning wages and start working, they just have much lower economic incentive to get married, because they just can provide for themselves. So once again, it is this big like hurricane and whirlwind of influences, some cultural, some economical, and we just have to make some sense of it. Yeah.
Well, it was great to have you on. Go check, like, if you haven't checked out his channel, you really should. If you like our stuff on demographics, He goes into it much more academically in a lot more detail. If people are like, Malcolm, Simone, I want your ideas, but in a lot more detail. That's why we wrote books. Okay. Like, you're on YouTube, you're here for the slop.
Yeah, you ain't gonna find it on YouTube. No, but KaiserBauch on YouTube is like so good, really well researched, and not just regions. Like one of your recent videos, I think from like a month ago, was sort of on the rise of incels internationally.
Yes.
And you sort of go into this, and it's just beautifully done. So thank you for what you do. Everyone definitely check out the channel. And yeah, please keep it up, and hopefully we'll be having more conversations soon.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and it was an honor. Thank you.
Great. I know that at that time we had forgotten to hit record.
Well, now we're recording, so we're safe.
That I do not remember seeing the recording bar in there from last time, so maybe this is the case.
Sorry.
No,
Simone, this is all your fault.
It's all my fault.
I have
It was meant to be. It was meant to be.
Well, yeah, honestly, I'm really excited to.
Back then. You've grown a lot since then, right? I don't remember you being like this big.
You put out some amazing content too. Like I was
He gets like 56,000 per video now.
Wow, you do.
Oh well, I do not really remember exactly how big the channel was when we were recording the last video. I'm not sure when it was, but sure, yeah, I guess it has grown a bit since then, which is great. I'm very grateful for it. Yeah.
Well done. Yes, that is amazing.
Thank you very much. But I think your channel is also growing as well, from what I saw.
It grew a ton in the election cycle, and now it's gone down since then.
And how are things in Trump's America?
Oh my gosh, amazing.
Oh yeah.
Too much winning.
I have to tell you, a lot of envy from the European side of the pond.
I can imagine.
It's gonna spread. It's gonna spread.
Yeah.
So we've got one of the things that, well, also we're now learning. I was just sending Simone that apparently Gamergate was funded by USAID, that organization that was recently shut down. And I was like, oh, so like this whole culture war was funded by the US government. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
But incredible amount of stuff in Europe was funded by this government agency. There are
really
a lot of like left-wing NGOs and sort of like media organization and news sites. It now is like, it seems a lot of it was just funded by US taxpayers' money, which is like really interesting.
That is. Well, yeah, I guess not surprising. So what
so two things I want to ask before we go further with this. Oh, how do I pronounce your channel's name? KaiserBauch?
KaiserBauch. The pronunciation is it's a German word, so it's Bauch.
Okay. It looks like a beer.
Yeah.
Like a beer?
Yeah, his channel's name looks like a beer logo to me and sounds like a beer. It's a wheat beer. I could even
like a
imagine what it tastes like.
That is good. Like I never thought of this, but when you say it, that's something to be proud of, I would say.
Yeah, you need to make merch. You have to have like your own like small batch beer brand. You know,
it's drunk enough to make babies.
Yeah.
Okay. I should do that. Being from the
here I'll start off.
Okay.
For anybody who wants to come, NatalCon is coming up very, very soon. You don't want to miss it. So if you haven't bought tickets yet and you intend to go or you're thinking about going, now is the time to go get them. You can get a discount with the code word Collins, all caps, and you can find it either just by Googling NatalCon or natalism.org. It is March 28th through 29th in Austin, Texas.